The house on the edge of the quiet town had always seemed too large for John. For years it was just him, long corridors echoing with silence, a kitchen where he cooked for one, and a garden that only half received the care it deserved. When he married Margaret, all of that changed overnight. Margaret was lively and graceful, the kind of woman who made every room feel warmer simply by stepping inside. She had a gift for rearranging furniture so that spaces felt more open, for cooking meals that filled the place with sense of comfort. John hadn't realized how much he had missed such things until they returned. But Margaret hadn't come alone. Along with her arrived her daughter, Emily. 16 years old, quiet but sharp-eyed, she carried herself with a mixture of shyness and defiance. For John, this was uncharted territory. He had never had children of his own, and now he found himself cast into the role of stepfather almost overnight. Emily treated him politely but distantly. At the dinner table, she would answer his questions with the briefest possible replies. When he offered to drive her to school, she would nod but keep her headphones on for the entire ride. When he fixed the loose hinge on her bedroom door, she whispered a quick thanks before vanishing into her room again. John understood. She had left behind her old house, her friends, her familiar streets, and now lived with someone who was practically a stranger. He decided not to push too hard. If she needed space, he would give it. If she needed him, he would be there. Yet over the weeks, small details caught his attention. Sometimes, late at night, he would pass by the living room and find Emily curled up with a book, her face lit by the lamp. Other times, while working in the garden, he'd notice her at the window, watching quietly before quickly drawing the curtain. She seemed torn between curiosity and hesitation, as though she wanted to bridge the distance but couldn't quite bring herself to do it. Margaret often reassured him, "Give her time, John. She's adjusting. It's not easy for her either." He nodded, even though part of him couldn't help but wonder what Emily truly thought of him. One evening, the three of them sat down for dinner. Rain tapped against the windows, and the sound filled the silences between their words. Margaret chatted about her day at work, John mentioned a project in the garden, and Emily listened in near silence, poking at her food. But when John described nearly tripping over the neighbor's cat that had snuck into the shed, Emily suddenly laughed. It was quick, almost surprised, but genuine. The sound startled both John and Margaret. Emily caught herself, cheeks turning pink, and lowered her gaze. John didn't say anything, but inside, something shifted. That fleeting laugh was the first crack in the wall she had built around herself. Over the next few days, moments like that began to happen more often. Emily would sometimes join Margaret in the kitchen, and when John passed through, she no longer avoided eye contact quite so quickly. She even asked him once if he could look at her desk chair, which wobbled. He fixed it, and she lingered in the doorway as he worked, almost as if she wanted to ask something more but decided against it. John began to notice her presence more acutely. The way she walked softly through the house, the strands of hair that slipped into her eyes when she bent over her homework, the quiet determination in her expression. These were details easy to miss, but now they seemed impossible not to see. He reminded himself constantly of his role, steady, patient, respectful. But still, there was an undercurrent he couldn't ignore, an awareness of the fragile balance in their new household. When Margaret suggested a weekend trip to the lake, John agreed immediately. He thought it might help Emily relax, maybe even feel more at home with both of them. On Friday evening, they packed bags into the car, and as the sun sank low, they drove out of town together. Emily sat in the back seat, headphones around her neck this time, gazing out the window. Occasionally, she would glance toward John's reflection in the rearview mirror, though she quickly looked away when their eyes met. The road stretched ahead, and though the lake was their destination, John sensed that the real journey had only just begun. The road wound through stretches of pine forest, the sky dimming into a muted orange as dusk settled in. Margaret dozed lightly in the passenger seat, her head leaning against the window. Emily remained quiet in the back seat, though the way she toyed absent-mindedly with her headphones suggested her thoughts were elsewhere. When they finally arrived, the cabin by the lake looked almost like a painting. Its wooden beams were weathered but sturdy, a thin chimney releasing faint smoke from the fire Margaret had arranged for their arrival. The lake itself stretched out beyond the trees, dark and still, reflecting the last traces of fading daylight. Emily stepped out of the car and inhaled deeply. For the first time since John had known her, she looked more at ease. Perhaps it was the distance from town, from school, from the noise of daily life. Here, surrounded by forest and water, she seemed less guarded. Beautiful, isn't it? John asked as he unloaded their bags. Emily nodded. It's quiet. It wasn't much, but he took it as progress. Inside, the cabin was cozy, 2 bedrooms, a small kitchen, and a living room dominated by a wide stone fireplace. Margaret set about unpacking groceries while John carried logs inside. Emily wandered around, her fingers grazing along the wooden furniture as though she were absorbing the space. That evening, they ate a simple dinner by the fire. Margaret spoke cheerfully about plans for tomorrow, maybe a hike, maybe canoeing on the lake. Emily listened silently, but her eyes glowed in the firelight, betraying a spark of interest. Later, when Margaret went to bed early, John stayed in the living room, tending the fire. He noticed Emily lingering nearby with a blanket draped around her shoulders. She sat in the armchair opposite him, curling her legs beneath her, a book open in her lap. The crackle of the flames filled the silence between them. For once, it wasn't an uncomfortable silence. "What are you reading?" John asked gently. Emily hesitated, then held up the book so he could see the cover. "It's for school, but I like it." He nodded. "I remember that one. Not an easy read, but it sticks with you." A small smile touched her lips, almost as if she were surprised he knew it. "Most people I mention it to have never heard of it." "Guess I'm full of surprises," he said lightly. Her smile lingered for a moment before she ducked her head back down to the book. The fire burned lower, the cabin quiet except for the occasional creak of the wood. John leaned back, watching the shifting glow of the flames. Out of the corner of his eye, he saw Emily glance at him once, then again, quickly returning to her reading each time. The following morning dawned crisp and cool. Mist hovered above the lake, and the air smelled of pine and damp earth. Margaret busied herself with preparing breakfast, while Emily wandered outside, hands stuffed in the pockets of her sweater. John followed after a few minutes, finding her standing near the water's edge. The lake was a mirror, reflecting the pale sky. Emily bent down, tossing a pebble across the surface. It skipped once, twice, before sinking. "Not bad," John said. She glanced at him. "You think you can do better?" It was the first time she had teased him, even lightly. He picked up a flat stone, weighed it in his palm, and sent it skimming. It danced across the water 5 times before disappearing. Emily raised her brows, clearly impressed though she tried to hide it. "Okay, maybe you can." John chuckled. "Practice. When I was your age, I spent summers by a river. Whole days wasted just skipping stones." Her eyes softened, as though she were filing away the piece of his past. Then, for the briefest moment, she seemed like a child again, open, curious, unburdened by the walls she usually carried. The day unfolded gently. They hiked through trails where sunlight spilled through branches. Margaret kept up a steady rhythm of conversation, but John noticed how Emily occasionally drifted closer to his side of the path. Asking him questions about the trees, the birds, the names of things she half remembered from school. By evening, the 3 of them were tired but content. Margaret retired to bed early once more, leaving John and Emily by the fireplace again. This time, Emily sat closer, not across the room but on the rug with her back against the couch. She pulled the blanket around her shoulders and looked at the fire, her profile outlined in amber light. John said nothing, simply listened to the wood crackle. But in the silence, he was acutely aware of how the air between them had changed. For the first time, it felt less like 2 strangers sharing space and more like 2 people slowly, cautiously, finding common ground. The next morning, sunlight spilled into the cabin, golden and warm. Emily stirred first, sliding out from under her blanket and stretching. John was already in the kitchen, pouring coffee into a mug. The aroma filled the small space, mingling with the faint scent of pine from outside. "Morning," John said, offering her a cup of cocoa. "Hot enough for the chill?" Emily accepted it with a quiet thanks, her fingers curling around the mug as though it were a lifeline. She took a tentative sip, eyes closing briefly at the warmth. They lingered in a comfortable silence, watching the smoke curl from the chimney and the mist hovering above the lake. John noticed how Emily's gaze lingered on small things, a ripple across the water, a bird landing on a distant branch, details most adults might miss. Margaret joined them shortly after, bustling about and suggesting a canoe trip. Emily hesitated at first, shifting her weight nervously, but the prospect of being out on the water seemed to intrigue her. Soon, they were gliding across the lake. The oars cut through the calm water with a rhythmic splash, and the quiet was only broken by the occasional bird call or the gentle slap of water against the canoe. John noticed Emily's hands gripping the edge of the boat slightly, knuckles white, though her eyes sparkled with curiosity. "You've got to lean into it a little," John said softly, nodding toward the motion of the canoe. "It'll make it easier." Emily tried, and the canoe steadied. A small laugh escaped her lips, surprising both of them. It was light, genuine, like a note breaking through the hush of the morning. "You're getting the hang of it," he encouraged. "Not bad for your first trip." She glanced at him, a flicker of acknowledgement passing between them. In that moment, it wasn't just the sun reflecting on the water, it was a reflection of trust, subtle but undeniable. Later, they pulled the canoe onto the shore. Margaret wandered ahead, snapping photos and pointing out wildflowers along the path. Emily stayed close to John, asking about the different trees and insects she noticed along the trail. He answered patiently, sometimes kneeling to show her how a leaf's pattern indicated its species, or how a particular bug moved in a unique way. By the time they returned to the cabin, Emily's initial reserve had softened considerably. That evening, after dinner, she sat near the fire once again, her legs tucked beneath her on the rug. John sat nearby, absent-mindedly tending the flames. "You're quiet tonight," he said, a gentle observation rather than a question. I like it," she admitted after a pause. "This place. The lake. The quiet." John nodded, recognizing the vulnerability in her voice. He didn't push further. Instead, he reached for a log, placing it carefully on the fire. Emily watched the flames flicker and lean, occasionally tossing tiny comments into the quiet air, observations about the trees, the smell of the cabin, even the way shadows stretched across the walls. John listened, offering small smiles and nods, acknowledging her words without intruding. It was subtle, but he could feel a change. Emily wasn't just present in the house, she was beginning to let him in, allowing herself to share pieces of her world with him. Later, as the night deepened, Emily curled up under a blanket on the couch, her book open but untouched. John noticed her drifting into thought, eyes distant yet soft. He sat across from her, reading quietly himself, aware that the silence between them had grown comfortable, almost companionable. For John, these moments were fragile but precious, small threads weaving a connection that had started with caution and curiosity. He realized that patience, observation, and respect were beginning to dissolve the invisible barriers between them. Outside, the lake shimmered under the moonlight, and the gentle rustling of trees whispered through the cabin. It felt as if the world had narrowed to the three of them, suspended in a perfect pause where trust could quietly grow, unnoticed but undeniable. And in that quiet, John caught himself noticing Emily in a way he hadn't before, not as a daughter, not as a child, but as a presence that was increasingly central to the rhythms of the house. A presence he wanted to understand, to protect, to simply be near. It was subtle, like the first hints of dawn, but unmistakable. The next morning, the lake was quiet, almost mirror-like, with fog curling above the water. Birds called softly, and the forest seemed to hold its breath. John, Margaret, and Emily moved about the cabin in the slow rhythm of the last day of their trip. Emily woke early, slipping outside before anyone else. John found her near the shoreline, hands in her pockets, staring at the water. For a moment, he simply stood behind her, letting her thoughts remain hers. "You know," he said finally, breaking the silence gently, "this place always feels different in the morning. Everything seems possible." She turned her head slightly, offering a small smile. "I think I understand what you mean." They stood together in quiet appreciation of the lake, the air crisp, the world stripped down to its simplest elements. For Emily, the mornings here had been moments of clarity, free from the pressures of school, social expectations, or the complicated feelings she carried at home. Breakfast was simple: toast, eggs, and coffee, shared with laughter and easy conversation. Margaret noticed the change in Emily, the subtle ease that had replaced her usual tension. Emily even joked about spilling a bit of juice, and everyone laughed. Packing up to leave, Emily lingered at the door of the cabin. She looked back at the lake one last time, her fingers brushing the frame as if trying to hold on to the memory. John watched silently, respecting the moment. Thank you, she said softly, turning to him. For everything. John nodded. For what it's worth, I think you made it easier for me too. The drive back to town was calm. Emily sat in the back seat again, but this time she seemed relaxed, leaning against the window and letting the scenery pass by. Occasionally, she would glance at John in the rearview mirror, and he would catch her eye with a small smile. No words were needed. Back home, the house felt different, lighter somehow. Emily moved through it with less hesitation, more confidence, and a quiet acknowledgement that John was a part of her life she could trust. He, in turn, felt a sense of fulfillment, knowing that patience and understanding had begun to bridge the distance between them. Evenings passed with shared routines, cooking together, small talks by the fire, quiet companionship. Their bond didn't need words to be meaningful. It was in the shared glances, the gentle laughter, the small gestures that showed mutual respect and care. Over time, Emily grew comfortable enough to invite John into her world in small ways, asking his opinion on school projects, seeking advice about books, or simply walking with him in the garden. And John learned to read the subtleties of her moods, offering guidance, humor, or silent presence as needed. Margaret watched them both with quiet satisfaction, seeing the fragile beginnings of a relationship that could withstand the awkwardness of change and the challenges of new family dynamics. The household, once uneasy and uncertain, had begun to feel like a home. By the end of that first season together, the unspoken bond between John and Emily was clear, a connection built on trust, patience, and gentle understanding. It wasn't the easy kind of closeness that happened overnight, but one carefully nurtured, full of quiet respect, moments of shared joy, and the subtle acknowledgement of each other's presence. And in that, there was a sense of completeness, not in dramatic declarations or sudden confessions, but in the simple, enduring reality of two people who had learned to coexist, support, and appreciate each other. The house on the edge of town was no longer just walls and furniture. It had become a place of beginnings, where connections formed quietly, with patience, and where a family, unusual in its own way, had started to grow. The lake, the forest, the small cabin, all were memories now, gentle reminders that the bridge between distance and trust could be built one careful step at a time. And as the days went on, John and Emily moved through life with the understanding that some bonds, subtle and unspoken, could be the strongest of all.